Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and tonight we want to talk about next. We're into the election season, and the question, I guess, comes up as to what are we going to do next with this new, or the committee that we end up with. And to help us understand it, we have Brendan Sweeney, who is now City Councilor at Large. And you're going to run for re-election, too.
I am, George, and thank you for having me on the show. I know once re-election season starts up, it's easy to focus on, the next term, but there's still a lot of work that we are undertaking right now and will be taking on throughout the rest of this year leading into next term. So it's an exciting time in Beverly.
So there's a lot of stuff that's hanging fire, if you will. It's ongoing. The Bass River overlay, it keeps coming up every so often. The issue on the bridges is going to be a perpetual problem if they believe it 13 years to replace the bridges. And the other interesting one is Dunham Road. Mm-hmm. The traffic on there is really getting to be a little bit nasty for the natives, because they have to put up with all this business that's going on in the development. And I think it's a great idea to have Cummings develop a new area, bring in new business, new opportunities for Beverly residents. But at the same time, there's still people that are living in this area. So I guess the question keeps coming up as to what's the balance between bringing in new business, bringing in new facilities, more buildings on Rantoul Street. I just saw there's going to be another 5-story one. And how do you feel that we should balance this out? Where's our priorities?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up a few things there. I think two big topics that you've mentioned that have been areas that I've been focusing on in my time on the council in the past year and a half or so, and will continue to focus on if I'm fortunate enough to be reelected. Yeah. Infrastructure, in talking about the bridge and the improvements potentially in the Dunham Road area, and then on the planning and economic development side. So I'm going to start there on planning and economic development, just because that's really been the area that we've probably focused the most on throughout this first term that I've been on the council. And you bring up an interesting point about balance. And Beverly has seen a lot of growth recently, more so than many other communities around us. And much of that has been positive. I'm a resident of downtown, and so I do see a more lively downtown than when I had first moved to Beverly, and I think that's a good thing. But what we as a council really tried to weigh in some of our recent votes that actually ended up restricting the allowable building height in downtown and a few other parts of the city was exactly that point that you had made about balance. And Beverly had been able to bring in a good number of housing. The state actually cited us as a model given how many units we had added. But the question that we had asked ourselves was, as a council, was the pace of development sustainable indefinitely? Mm-hmm. And so while we didn't necessarily tackle that question head on, what we did do is set a standard going forward for what future development in the community will look like. And we took kind of a first base step in setting building heights. And so what we did is we lowered building height maximums on Rantoul to 5 stories, on Cabot to 4 stories, and then 3.5 to 3 stories pretty much everywhere else. My neighborhood, which is right in between Rantoul and Cabot, plenty of historic homes there, a lot of those, old school 3-decker houses, one of them that I live in. We limited that neighborhood to 3.5 stories. Yeah. And so the hope there is that by taking this first step, we set a standard of, at a very baseline level, the parameters that we'd like future development to conform to in terms of height. Mm-hmm. And now the next big step that we are going to undertake, and the city's planning office and planning director Darlene Nguyen in particular has really been working hard on this, is proposing design standards. And what that will do, so the city council has voted on building heights and set those parameters. What the design standards will do is focus more on the other aspects of building in terms of setback requirements, greenery requirements. That's a big one, in making sure that buildings aren't being built right up to the curb, but that there is some landscaping between a sidewalk and a building. requirements in terms of how parking needs to be structured, entrances and exits, and then also some design features. And that's one area that I have actually been taking a look at now. Councilor Houseman, who's another big advocate for finding ways to preserve some of the historic features of Beverly's building that I think when people cite the character of Cabot Street in particular, that's what they're referring to. While the design standards might not be the best avenue to do that, that's something that the council's also likely going to look at, if not this term, then next term. And so those aspects of development allow us to continue to grow when it makes sense in a sustainable manner, but to do so in a way that's consistent with many of the aspects of Beverly's aesthetics that people have come to enjoy.
So what do you mean by design standards?
So essentially what the document will be, and we've seen some drafts, there was a working group that was composed of councilors and planning board members as well as members of the public and planning staff that was convened to focus on some of the elements of prescriptive building standards that we otherwise don't have currently in our zoning ordinance. And that's where,
Give me,
like,
for instance.
So think about Rantoul Street and some of the buildings that have gone in there. There are certain minimum requirements of set. Go ahead.
Are you talking about the aesthetics of the building, or?
Yeah, well, the aesthetics would be part of it. There would be certain standards in terms of a first floor design of the external aspect of a building being different than the second, third, fourth floor. That's not something I believe that we currently have in our zoning ordinance, so that would be a factor that would allow us to differentiate design from what is currently permitted. Another thing that's really important is setback requirements, but then also coupling those setback requirements with certain greenery requirements, whether it's shrubs or just grass in between buildings and curbs. That's something that doesn't exist on many of the buildings on Rantoul, and so going forward, I think that would be a good way to help when people, I'm sure you've heard some folks who are not as thrilled about development on Rantoul maybe talking about the tunnel aspect.
Yeah.
This would be a good way to help combat that in future development. And that's not something that we have currently outlined in our city zoning ordinances. So by implementing these design standards as a more prescriptive document that tells developers here's what our city is looking for in future development, I think it'll also help them as well, because in the initial planning stages, and again, developers spend money to put these plans together to go through the planning board and whatnot, having some guidance on their end as to what the city's looking for, I think would help get a better final product in terms of future development that a developer could still potentially make money off of, but then fits within some of these standards that the community has articulated.
Well, I think some of the examples you point out is, I noticed was one of the first buildings that went up on Rantoul Street. They had apartments on the first floor. So you're walking down the sidewalk and you're looking into somebody's bedroom or living room. Doesn't make sense, I think, for a city. And at the same time, you look at something like New York City and the canyon problem, and they ended up with what they call the wedding cake design, where every floor you go up, you have to set back further and further.
Yep.
So you end up with these characteristics that, and the other one I always get a kick out of is, they had a joke running around when I was living in Chicago of, why does a certain ethnic group have such a low suicide rate? Well, it's hard to commit suicide jumping out of the window of a basement apartment, which is another one of these kinds of situations where if you look at some of the classic buildings in Boston, the first floor is 6 to 8 steps up to the level and makes access to a basement apartment doable. So I think these kind of things, I like the idea that you're going to put some standards in that you ain't going to do that no more around here at one time. But at the same time, I think there needs to be some degree of flexibility because, as you point out, the contractor and the builder have to make money at this thing. Otherwise, why are they doing it?
And that's where, by putting the building heights in place, which the council has already done, building height restrictions, by providing design standards, we, from the onset as a community, say to any future developer, here is what we expect to be built in Beverly, if anything is to be built in Beverly at all, so that we don't run into an issue of overdevelopment. And that's really an important first step we've taken as a council, is setting the building height limitations. And then this second step, which hopefully is something that we will be discussing this fall, will be soliciting community input and going through a process of implementing design standards within our city ordinances.
Well, this whole situation relative to the Family Dollar store in that block got to be somewhat, I think, reactionary instead of proactive. Because along comes the contractor and says, hey, I'll buy this lot for $7 million and take down some of these buildings, and I'll put up 154 apartments or condos, I forget which one it was.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And then all of a sudden the city finds out, but we're renting that space for parking downtown. And I think we lose, 100 and some odd
Yeah,
parking
over 100
spaces. Which, you can make it happen. It doesn't necessarily put too much of a crimp on the Cabot or the Larkham Theater or some of the other facilities, but it does. And again, back to your initial comment about vibrant downtown, it's nice if we've got a walkable downtown, and everybody that wants to go to lunch or dinner walks from their apartment or their condo over to it. But at the same time, you want to bring in people from the suburbs, periphery. They got to have a place to park.
Exactly, and I'm glad you brought this up. I know we had started the discussion about planning and zoning, more generally mentioning economic development. And now I think when you think of economic development holistically, it's not only development in the sense of you want to have businesses grow and set up in your city, and you want to have housing so that folks who live downtown are able to patronize the businesses. But another big thing is in terms of retaining folks who come into the city, like you mentioned, from the suburbs. And Beverly, as a diverse city, we have a handful of suburbs. You can't, it'd be a long walk. You could try it, but it's much more practical if you live in North Beverly to drive to downtown.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's where it's crucially important that we do have a sufficient supply of parking downtown. And so for me, I live downtown. I can walk to the Cabot Theater whenever my wife and I go see a show there.
Yeah.
It's a nice benefit of living downtown. Somebody from North Beverly or Beverly Farms, they're going to drive in, and if there's nowhere to park or limited spaces of parking and tough competition, that could have an adverse impact of actually reducing the amount of folks that are coming, whether it's from within Beverly or from around the North Shore into downtown to go out to dinner, to go see a show. And so that's why I was glad to see the mayor propose the friendly taking, essentially, that we had approved as a council of that lot, so that we could preserve access to parking, which in my mind is crucially important to allowing for a vibrant downtown from folks both within downtown and outside of downtown to come in and enjoy the restaurants, see a show, otherwise walk around. But without that parking, you would really limit the opportunity for folks who don't live in the immediate downtown to come in and bring new business for the folks that we are trying to support, the small business owners downtown.
We're already struggling with that problem with that new restaurant where McDonald's used to be.
Yeah, the Mission Boathouse. It's certainly tight there.
Again, it's very limited parking locally, and I think it's going to come to a point where the city is going to have to subsidize parking around the area. And I think it's part of this taking of the Family Dollar store kind of thing.
One quick thing to add just on that, in case for folks who may not have been following on our recent meetings, we did, and we were fortunate to have received some state grant money to help. We purchased the lot where Rowan's used to be. And so it's my understanding that while we're still working with neighbors from Goat Hill and other areas around that immediate space about what the final product is going to be, the goal is to add to the existing parking capacity in that area right under the bridge. So hopefully that helps to alleviate some of the issues, but it's a good thing that we have two, between now Mission Boathouse and the Anchor, two pretty popular restaurants right on the waterfront, but that's the challenge, is people need to park unless they live in that immediate neighborhood.
And the other issue that came out of this Family Dollar is instead of building 154 apartments, they're only talking about 50 or 40. 54.
It'll be a smaller number.
Smaller number, and at something below market rate. So it's a little more affordable than, quote, affordable housing.
That's the hope. Another thing to add on that, so we purchased the property. The immediate use is going to be for temporary housing for City Hall.
Yeah.
And that's City Hall is being renovated, which is a good thing. The building certainly could use some renovations. And so city staff will operate within the footprint of that Family Dollar. And then the process will really unfold in terms of what's next. Once we have a better idea of how long we need to occupy this temporary space, we know the timeline for completion of the project at City Hall, and begin to move folks out of the Family Dollar back into City Hall a few years from now. That's when we'll really start to look at, do we list an RFP to sell off that storefront on Cabot Street, and what would we like to see? I know for me, I actually went to the Family Dollar pretty frequently, oftentimes for the grocery store aspect of it, because it was walking distance from my house.
Yeah.
Do we want to try to replace that and find a small grocer to operate downtown? And then that's when we'll look at and I'm committed to this as a councilor, preserving public parking on that footprint in the same number or greater number of spaces than exists. So that's really non-negotiable for me, is that the city needs to maintain public parking there, but potentially in addition to maintaining that public parking is when we'd see maybe building some housing on top of a public parking garage. And that will be a process where we try to solicit some public input when we get closer to the point of actually listing or partnering with, whether it's an affordable housing developer or the city maybe taking a step back and just issuing an RFP. Whenever we get closer to that process is when we'll start bringing in community input for what would make sense on that site.
And I think this is where it gets to be a real challenge, that if the city wants to get into housing that is below market rate to some extent, and that's another debate of how much below you want these buildings to be, the city is going to end up subsidizing it in some way or form or other, because if it was something that is a good business plan, it would happen automatically. But to make it happen, the city's going to have to put money into it, either directly or indirectly. Either we do it by subsidizing the development, or sell it with less than the $7 million that it's worth, or the $7 million that it's assessed at.
Yep.
And I think this is going to have to be a very difficult decision or discussion for the city council of how much city involvement are we going to put into another parking space or another building space. And I was somewhat surprised that when they tried to put a apartment on top of the MBTA garage, that went down in flames.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't the best proposal. There was no real commitment from the developer in terms of definitive parking. So that didn't make sense for our downtown.
Yeah.
And was glad to see the final outcome that there won't, at least for the immediate time being, be a building on top of that garage. But going back to your point about the balance between subsidizing housing in order to make it affordable and how heavy-handed the city should be in that process, my focus, and I have talked to many folks around the city about this, and I know that others feel the same way, is finding a way to add to what we really don't have a whole ton of currently in our housing stock, what I call workforce housing.
Yeah.
And that's where our city's workforce is pretty diverse, and even just within City Hall, when you think about teachers, police officers, firefighters, and then we have a host of folks that work in the service industry downtown. Finding housing for those folks who work in Beverly so that they can live in Beverly, that's a goal of mine. And so what is the right level of city involvement in order to foster a market environment? And that's, we've talked about it. Developers need to make money. They need to be profitable in order to build. And so it's an interesting dynamic. It's one that we've already started to weigh on the city council. One thing we did as part of limiting building height maximums is we actually tweaked what's called our inclusionary housing ordinance. And so the area median income, AMI, is the standard that is used to set affordable housing rates. And we, as a city, had said to developers building of, I believe the threshold is 6 units or more, that you need to have 12% of your units offered at 60% or less of area median income. That number was 80% before we made that change.
Yeah.
And so that's where the city is setting a standard for developers as opposed to using tax dollars to subsidize housing.
Yeah.
But a developer may look at that calculus and say, well, it's not profitable for me. We hope that's not the case, and based on our research and conversation with developers, we don't think that'll be the case.
Yeah.
But that's something that our city set that standard and said we think that 60% AMI level will allow for more housing for the workforce within Beverly, whether it's in City Hall or other places around the city.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope kind of thing, because there was an article recently in the Globe about the miserable condition of municipal housing. This has been a classic case going back to Cabrini Green and Igor Pruitt, where they actually tore the buildings down because they were so badly deteriorated. And this is one of the characteristics, I think, of city-managed housing, is they don't take care of it, and you run into a problem. So there's got to be a way to keep it private, because they will reinforce their development to maintain it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and that's where we're not looking to expand the Beverly Housing Authority's footprint necessarily.
Yeah.
What we're looking to do is utilize the tools in our toolbox as the city council to incentivize developers to build and offer housing at a price that is affordable to folks that otherwise have really been priced out of Beverly.
Yeah.
But to add to your point and just make clear, that's privately owned housing. The city is not necessarily looking to expand its footprint in terms of publicly owned housing.
No, and that's a good sign, because you've got to make it attractive so that some developer can come in, make money at it, and still end up with, as you say, workforce housing. And this has got to be a solution. There's no way out of it, because otherwise you can't get a workforce to support the downtown vibrant area.
And it's a dynamic process, and that's one thing that I mentioned when we were voting on building heights, is that we need to, as a city council, and really as a city as a whole, consistently reevaluate what the housing market is in Beverly and how we could use our ability as city government to potentially tweak market factors in the favor of the working class folks and middle class folks that otherwise are struggling to afford the housing they're in, or just find a house to move into. So that's something that we need to consistently reevaluate. It's not a one and done process.
When you talk about the area median income, is it for the city of Beverly only, or is it this Boston?
It's regional.
It's regional.
I think we're north of the Boston region, but you get a lot of those satellite cities within the calculation that is used for Beverly also.
Yeah, because the median income in Beverly is like $79,000.
Yeah,
and you get into the regional one, and you're up in the high 80s. So it just makes it much more difficult. And I think that's one of the things I'd like to see you consider is, hey, make it on the local average, because that's where the problem is.
No, that's something we talked about. I know that area median income fluctuates, and that's the benefit of that. But it's a challenge. It's something we've got to consider.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we've had a half hour of fun.
Time flies by every time I'm on the show with you, George.
And there's so many more. I got a whole list of stuff I never even got to. Like, I think I warned you in advance. But there's a lot of issues that are worth talking about. And would like to invite you back sometime in the near future.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Continue the discussion.
Talk about infrastructure, talk about the charter. There's a lot for us to continue to discuss.
Yeah, the charter is going to be a big issue, I think. And I think we'd probably wait until the word comes down from Boston what we can put in the charter. But since you said you're going to run for re-election, I guess you would like to make your pitch. And there's the camera, and it's all yours.
Thank you, George, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in to watch the show. I always enjoy joining George and others to discuss the pressing issues in our city. Beverly really is a great place to live. I've enjoyed the last year and a half or so that I've been on the council and the chance to give back, to continue improving the city and building on the things that make it great. But there is still a lot of work for us to do. As George and I have discussed, we made some real progress in my first term, especially on the planning and economic development front and really setting the standards for what the future of Beverly is going to look like. But there's still a lot to do that I'd like to focus in if I am fortunate enough to be reelected. We briefly discussed infrastructure. As basic as roads and sidewalks certainly need to be improved, but also focusing on some bigger infrastructure projects, looking at how to build off of the city's historic assets, whether it's through historic preservation or otherwise, and then continuing on the economic development front and really making sure that Beverly is a sustainable city, both in terms of growth but environmentally sustainable. So there's certainly a lot that the City Council has discussed and will continue to address, and I am humbly asking that you would consider voting for me to send me back to continue the work that we've been undertaking. Thanks, George.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. And as I mentioned, I've got a long list of issues that I think are worth talking about. But if you've got some issue that you want to bring up, at the end of the credits is my email address. Send me an email. And if you have some more definitive thoughts that you'd like to share with the city, I can always make room for you here at the table. And as Brendan said, thank you very much for watching this evening. And we'll be back. Stay tuned.